Welcome to the debate. So, if a sports team signs a foreign player and that player pays income tax to a hostile government, did that team just indirectly buy a bullet for the enemy?
Wow. It's a heavy question.
It really is. Today, we are looking at a pretty severe collision between global sports commerce and, well, active military conflict.
Right. And it's a collision sparked by the recent player auction for the 100. For those who don't know, that's a major short-format cricket tournament in England.
Mm-hmm.
An English franchise called Sunrisers Leeds signed a Pakistani spin bowler, Abrar Ahmed. And the complication, the real issue at the heart of our discussion today, is that Sunrisers Leeds is actually owned by the Sun Group, which is a massive Indian media conglomerate.
Exactly. In this specific transaction, prompted the Indian cricket legend Sunil Gavaskar to write this newspaper column with a very stark, unyielding thesis.
Very stark.
Right. He essentially argues that an Indian-owned entity paying a Pakistani player indirectly contributes to the deaths of Indian soldiers and civilians. Because, that player pays income tax to a government that buys weapons.
Yeah, the literal flow of money.
Exactly. Now, I'll be taking the position that global sports franchises operating in foreign jurisdictions, they have to evaluate players strictly on sporting merit and local employment laws. You simply have to keep the individual athletes separate from the geopolitical conflicts of the franchise owner's home country.
And, well, my position is that in the context of active military conflict, the flow of capital from an Indian-owned entity to a hostile state's tax base, it carries profound security and moral implications.
Mm-hmm.
You just can't ignore those implications under the convenient guise of sports globalization and foreign employment law. It's not just business as usual.
Right, but to understand the mechanics of this conflict, we really have to look at how a cricket team in Leeds, England, ends up being owned by an Indian conglomerate in the first place.
Yeah, the whole financial evolution of the sport.
Exactly. For anyone who doesn't follow the business of international cricket, the landscape has completely transformed over the last 15 years. I mean, it is no longer just national teams playing bilateral series against each other.
No, not at all. We are living in the era of the franchise model, which was, essentially pioneered by the Indian Premier League, the IPL.
Right.
It operates very much like the City Football Group in soccer, where the owners of Manchester City also own subsidiary teams in New York, Melbourne, Mumbai. The IPL owners have evolved into these massive multinational sports corporations.
And the Sun Group is a perfect example of that.
Exactly. They own Sunrisers Hyderabad in the IPL, they expanded to own Sunrisers Eastern Cape in South Africa, and now, well, they've purchased Sunrisers Leeds in the UK's tournament, the 100.
Right, because the England and Wales Cricket Board, the ECB, they created the 100 as the city-based competition to attract new audiences. And recently, they opened up ownership of these 8 teams to private investors.
And the IPL franchises naturally bought in.
Yeah, because they have the capital and the operational expertise, right? So you have Kovi Amaran, the CEO of the Sunrisers franchise, physically sitting at an auction table in England, bidding on international players to build a roster for her UK team.
Which brings us to the profound historical and geopolitical baggage sitting at that exact same auction table.
Yeah.
I mean, we cannot discuss an Indian corporate entity hiring a Pakistani player without explicitly acknowledging the 2008 Mumbai attacks.
It changed everything.
It permanently altered the DNA of the IPL. In the very first season of the IPL, Pakistani players participated. But after the Mumbai attacks, Pakistani players were completely banned from the Indian Premier League.
Mm-hmm.
It is an unwritten but ironclad reality of the competition.
And it's a total freeze that extends far beyond just domestic leagues, right? India and Pakistan haven't played a bilateral international cricket series since 2013. We are at a point where national teams have recently declined to even shake hands in international fixtures. The sporting relationship is entirely broken.
Well, it's broken because the geopolitical relationship is broken, and the backdrop is exceptionally acute right now.
Yeah.
We're not talking about abstract historical tension from decades ago. India and Pakistan engaged in a 4-day military conflict just last April, following a deadly militant attack on tourists in India-administered Kashmir.
Right, it's very recent.
We are talking about active, ongoing hostilities, which is exactly why Gavaskar's column resonated so deeply in India. It is rooted in immediate, palpable trauma.
I get that. I really do. But Gavaskar's core argument relies on what I would call this tax-to-weapons pipeline. He argues that the auction fees paid to Abrar Ahmed inevitably filter into Pakistan's national income tax, that tax revenue goes into the state treasury, which buys arms, which leads to Indian casualties.
Right. The math checks out.
But applying this hyper-literal economic chain to private individuals, it completely destroys the foundation of international commerce.
How so?
Well, imagine a massive multinational technology company headquartered in India, right? They open a regional office in London and hire a Pakistani software engineer. Is that Indian tech company now funding state-sponsored terrorism because their London-based engineer pays taxes back home in Islamabad?
Come on, a software engineer writing code in some anonymous corporate office is not the same thing as a highly visible, highly lucrative sports franchise acting as a cultural ambassador.
But the economic principle is identical.
Your analogy strips away the scale, the visibility, and, frankly, the cultural weight of the transaction. Gavaskar's math is entirely correct. When India and Pakistan engaged in that military conflict last April, the bullets and the logistics were funded by state coffers.
Obviously, but
Capital flows matter. The absolute fungibility of money means that taxes injected into a hostile state's treasury do, in fact, support its military apparatus. When an Indian owner actively facilitates that specific capital flow, it elevates from a standard business transaction to a substantive issue of national security.
okay, but you are asking a multinational corporation to balkanize its human resources department based on the shifting diplomatic relations of its founding nation.
When lives are at stake? Yes.
But if every global entity, whether in sports, finance, or technology, had to vet the passports of its employees in third-party countries against the home country's military adversaries, globalized enterprise would just collapse.
I think collapse is a strong word.
You would be forcing Indian companies operating in the UK to implement discriminatory hiring practices against Pakistani nationals, or, Chinese companies operating in the US to discriminate against Taiwanese nationals, and so on. It is an entirely unworkable corporate standard.
Well, when bullets are flying, the ideals of seamless globalized enterprise ring very hollow, don't you think?
It's not just ideals, it's the law.
But look at the social media backlash we saw. It was severe enough that the Sunrisers Leeds account was temporarily suspended. That stems from a population that views this tax-to-weapons pipeline as a literal threat to their survival.
I understand the emotion behind it.
The Sun Group wants the financial windfall and the prestige of owning a team in the UK, but they want to shed the moral and geopolitical responsibilities of being an Indian entity. Gavaskar is essentially pointing out the hypocrisy. You cannot be an Indian patriot in Hyderabad and a borderless, neutral capitalist in Leeds.
A corporate entity operating in Leeds is bound by the jurisdiction of Leeds. We're talking about evaluating a professional athlete. Abrar Ahmed put his name into a draft to play a game of cricket.
He's still paying taxes?
But holding a private citizen accountable for his home nation's military budget by denying him employment in a third-party country? That strips him of his basic autonomy. He is a spin bowler offering a highly specialized skill. He is not an agent of the Pakistani state.
No one is saying he's a state agent.
But to reduce his entire humanity and professional worth to his taxable income and his government's military budget is just a profoundly cynical way to view the world.
Geopolitics is inherently cynical. Gavaskar's argument isn't against Abrar Ahmed as a human being, it's an argument about the mechanics of state funding.
Okay.
Let's look at the mechanics of the draft room itself. Sunrisers Leeds head coach Daniel Vettori, a New Zealander, is the one making the sporting calls.
Right.
And Gavaskar explicitly gave Vettori a pass in his column, noting the coach may not have understood the dynamic. The failure here isn't on a New Zealand coach for picking a talented spinner.
No, of course not.
The failure is on the Sun Group's ownership for not providing appropriate corporate guardrails to prevent this entirely predictable collision.
Expecting a cricket coach to navigate the unspoken geopolitical red lines of his employer's home country is absurd.
Which is why the ownership should have
Daniel Vittori's mandate is to look at a player's spin rate, their economy rate, their bowling average, and build a winning cricket team based purely on sporting merit. If we demand that coaches run background checks on the diplomatic relations between their ownership's origin country and a player's passport, we aren't playing sports anymore.
We haven't just been playing sports for a long time.
We'd be conducting proxy warfare through sports administration. It's ridiculous.
Which is precisely why Kavya Morand and the Sun Group leadership needed to step in and direct their coach. You cannot divorce Sunrisers Leeds from Sunrisers Hyderabad. They are part of the exact same global portfolio.
But they operate in different countries.
Sunrisers Hyderabad kicks off the new IPL season against the defending champions Royal Challengers Bengaluru later this month. They will be operating under that accepted, ironclad ban on Pakistani players. The ownership understands this reality implicitly.
Sure, in India.
To let their Kiwi coach blindly cross a massive cultural and political fault line in the UK shows a staggering disconnect from their own domestic security realities. They should have told Vittori that Pakistani players were simply off the board.
The ownership didn't fail to provide guardrails. They were boxed in by the regulatory realities of the jurisdiction they were operating in. You are completely ignoring the legal mechanism of how the 100 operates.
Legal mechanisms don't supersede national security.
Prior to this auction, there were widespread rumors that the 4 IPL-linked 100 franchises were considering avoiding Pakistani players entirely to avoid this exact backlash.
Right.
The England and Wales Cricket Board caught wind of this and explicitly intervened. They wrote to all 8 teams specifically to remind them of their legal responsibilities around anti-discrimination.
The ECB applying a standard Western human resources framework over an active hostile state scenario is incredibly naive.
It is not naive. It is the law of the land in the United Kingdom. Under UK employment law and ECB regulations, an employer cannot physically look at a passport to determine eligibility or deny employment based on nationality.
But this isn't a normal...
The governing body released a joint statement declaring that players must not be excluded on the grounds of nationality. Abrar Ahmed was signed in the UK to play in a UK tournament governed by UK laws.
Right, but...
And he wasn't just him. There were 2 Pakistani women, Fatima Sana and Sadi Iqbal, in the auction for the women's 100. There were 5 Pakistani men in the men's draw. Usman Tariq was drafted by Birmingham Phoenix. This is a standard competition dynamic. If a franchise selectively blacklists players based on their owner's home country politics, that franchise risks its license to operate in that league.
Okay, but a massive constituency in India views that strict adherence to UK anti-discrimination policy as a direct insult to their national trauma. We really have to look at the cultural weight of the criticism here.
I'm not denying the cultural weight.
Sunil Gavaskar is not a fringe internet troll making noise for clicks.
Obviously.
He is a monumental figure in the history of the sport. He is a 76-year-old icon, the first man to reach 10,000 runs in Test cricket, a 1983 World Cup winner, and an outspoken pundit for the BBC's Test Match Special.
I agree, his voice matters immensely.
When he speaks, he is articulating a deeply held sentiment shared by millions, dismissing his perspective and the perspective of a nation that just endured a military conflict as a mere HR violation of ECB policy fundamentally misunderstands the scale of the anger. You cannot cure geopolitical hostility with an ECB press release reminding teams about diversity.
I am not suggesting an ECB press release cures geopolitical hostility. I am pointing out the operational impossibility of Gavaskar's demand.
Why is it impossible?
If the Sun Group overtly instructs its UK subsidiary to ban Pakistani players, they are explicitly asking that subsidiary to break UK employment law. You simply cannot operate a business in England and routinely violate English anti-discrimination mandates because of a conflict happening in South Asia.
Well,
if Sunrisers Leeds loses its license for discriminatory hiring, the Sun Group loses a multi-million-dollar international investment.
Then perhaps Indian conglomerates shouldn't buy sports teams in jurisdictions where local laws force them to fund their military adversaries.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that is the core contradiction of modern sports ownership. These companies want the prestige and the revenue of a global portfolio, but they recoil when the global portfolio requires them to violate their domestic moral obligations.
Moral obligations according to one perspective.
Gavaskar's logic holds firm.
If you are contributing to a system that taxes wages to buy weapons that harm your own people, the geography of where that transaction took place is entirely irrelevant to the people suffering the consequences. The moral and physical threat remains exactly the same whether the paycheck was written in Hyderabad or in Leeds.
That logic still treats Abrar Ahmed as a proxy for the Pakistani state, rather than a private individual participating in a global labor market. We talk about sports as a meritocracy, right?
Ideally, yes.
If we abandon the principle that individuals should be judged on their own abilities, independent of their government's actions, we destroy the entire framework of international competition. Are we really going to demand that every individual athlete answer for the foreign policy of their home country before they are allowed onto a field?
When their home country is actively engaged in military conflict with the country of the people signing their paychecks, yes, that is the harsh reality of state security.
But
Gavaskar isn't asking Abrar Ahmed to answer for foreign policy. He is asking the Indian owners to answer for their capital flow. He literally said, whether it is an Indian entity or an overseas subsidiary, if the owner is Indian, then he or she is contributing to the Indian casualties. It's as simple as that.
it's rarely as simple as that.
For a franchise owner, navigating that reality isn't about abandoning the unifying power of sports. It is about recognizing that sports franchises do not exist outside the boundaries of international security.
What we are looking at is a fundamental clash between the jurisdiction of play and the nationality of capital.
Exactly.
The integrity of international competition relies on separating the individual athlete from the actions of their state. When a franchise operates under a host nation's jurisdiction, like Sunrisers Leeds operating under the ECB, they must evaluate athletes based on sporting merit and local employment law. Holding a private citizen accountable for his home nation's military budget by denying him employment in a third-party country doesn't solve geopolitical crises. It simply conducts proxy warfare through human resources departments.
But in an era of globalized franchise ownership, corporate entities cannot just shed their national identities or their moral responsibilities simply by crossing a border. The Sun Group is an Indian entity, intimately tied to the cultural and economic fabric of a nation that recently engaged in military conflict with Pakistan. In that acute context, capital flows matter. Paying a player from a hostile state indirectly bolsters that state's military apparatus. To pretend otherwise in the name of foreign HR policies is, frankly, a complete failure of corporate and moral leadership.
Well, this tension between the idealistic, borderless vision of globalized sport and the unyielding realities of state security is only going to intensify.
Absolutely. As sports ownership becomes increasingly multinational, these fault lines, where local employment regulations collide head-on with home country security realities, they will rupture again and again.
It really forces us to ask whether a global franchise can ever truly possess a neutral international identity or, if it will always carry the geopolitical passport of its parent company. Thank you for joining us on The Debate, and we'll leave you to draw your own conclusions on where that boundary should truly be drawn.